Appreciate you, and very much appreciate the work that this committee does trying to make Georgia a better place with regard to its tax code. And y'all have done a lot of great work over the years. You have opportunities to do some more, and we just want to encourage you and support you in that work. As the chairman alluded to, my name is Kyle Wingfield. I'm president and CEO of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. We have put together a study here that I'll talk about in a moment, but I wanted to kind of frame the reason for the study and kind of some of the main takeaways from it, so that as you start looking at it, you have that in your mind. Georgia is a low tax state in a highly competitive neighborhood from a tax standpoint. We're sandwiched between two zero income tax states in Tennessee and Florida. We have another neighbor to our northeast in North Carolina that has been steadily whittling away at its income tax rates for about a decade now. They went from having a higher tax rate than us to a lower one during that time, and they're not done. They've been using a revenue trigger approach similar to what this legislature adopted in House Bill 1437 2 years ago. So when you look at that and you say, well, if we're a low tax state, why do we need to worry about anything? Well, how the state raises its revenues does matter. There are certain taxes that affect the economy more than others. And I think economists generally agree that income taxes from an economic standpoint are more destructive than certain other types of taxes. And so what you see is not just states in our neighborhood, but states we compete with elsewhere around the country. There's a trend of trying to lower those income tax rates. And as I mentioned, the state of Georgia set itself on a course to do some of that 2 years ago. And the other principle here is that generally speaking, the private sector will spend money more productively than the public sector. It doesn't mean that there's no place for government spending or programs. If that were the case, y'all could come here every year, put a zero on the budget, and go home. That's not what you do. There's plenty of good work that you fund around the state. But what it does mean is that given a choice, once the government has done the things that only it can do, it's better to err on the side of leaving the money in the hands of the private sector rather than having the government spend it. And generally speaking, that will grow the economy and increase productivity. So when the Joint Tax Credit Review Panel was doing its work this summer, I know some of you were involved with that or followed its work. We brought one of our colleagues from the state of Ohio, Ray Hederman with the Buckeye Institute, our sister think tank there, to address that panel. After that, and in talking with several members of that panel, we got together with them to produce a study which has been distributed to, I brought about a dozen copies, so some of you have it in front of you. I think it's been distributed electronically to the rest of you. It is available now for those in the audience as well at our website, georgiapolicy.org. And we really wanted to study some different scenarios for how Georgia could remain competitive, raise revenues more efficiently, and stimulate growth via the private sector keeping more of the money there. So I'm just going to talk through some of the high-level findings from these 4 scenarios that our friends at the Buckeye Institute modeled. You will see in your table of contents, there's a lot more than 12 or 14 pages here. We're just a poor little nonprofit. I didn't print all the appendices here with all the formulas and everything, but that's all included in the PDF version on our website. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, first of all, I applaud you, but second of all, you can find that information there if you were interested. This is really just the main takeaways here. So the first scenario that we had them model was along the lines of what HB 1437 did in 2022, but at an accelerated and extended clip. So as you may know, that bill set in place some revenue triggers, which, if met, would cut the state's personal income tax rate from the flat 5.49% that it set for this year by an additional 1/10 of 1 percentage point per year until it reached 4.99%. So what we did in scenario 1 was we asked them to go farther at the very beginning and then go faster and reach an endpoint of 3.99 instead of 4.99. And so you can see in table 1 on page 6, that's what they did. The top part of these tables represents the baseline. So that's what is forecast, and they incorporate some forecasts from the Congressional Budget Office into these models. What would be forecast to be the state's gross domestic product, level of employment, tax revenue, consumer behavior, and investment. And then the bottom part of each table, you can see the change from that baseline if these reforms were adopted. So that table number 1, if you drop the tax rate the first year, that would be this year, to 5.19, and then drop by 0.2 of a percentage point per year until you reach 3.99. You can see that by the year 2030, we would have that 3.99% tax rate. We would have boosted states' gross domestic product by more than $5 billion. More than 16,000 new jobs would have been created. Consumption would have risen, investment would have risen as well. Scenario 2, we asked them to take a look at what it would be like to eliminate the state's corporate income tax over a period of 5 years. And so you can see in table 2 what happens there. There's not as much revenue to be foregone with the corporate income tax. It doesn't raise as nearly as much as the personal income tax, and you can see the effects there. Scenario 3 is using some of the surplus revenues that the state's accumulated during this surge of revenue over the past couple of years to buy down the personal income tax rate over a period of 5 years up to a total of $5 billion. And you can see that would get the state down by 2028 to a personal income tax rate of 3.75. Now, I would point out to you, if you compare scenarios 2 and 3, you see that you're cutting about twice as many revenues in scenario 2, or 3, rather, the personal income tax cut, but you actually increase state GDP by about the same either way. What that tells us is you get a greater bang for your buck cutting corporate income taxes than personal income taxes. Now, I realize when it comes to the political scenario, you may not get quite the bang for your buck, but when it comes to the economic scenario, that is a more efficient way to cut taxes. You get more productivity for doing that. And then the last scenario we asked was for a revenue neutral tax reform, which would reduce tax expenditures, tax credits, tax deductions, whatever they might be, by a total of $500 million per year, and use that revenue to offset a $500 million per year cut in the personal income tax. And what you see there is you could reduce the personal income tax below 5%, but you don't really see any economic effects there. Now, do I believe there would be zero economic effects of doing that? No, I don't. I think that you would probably see some job creation at the margins. You would probably see some economic growth at the margins. What it means is that the model can't really discern it can't go granular enough to discern what those effects would be, and so it tells you it's a zero effect. And the bottom line there is when you're keeping state revenues the same either way, you're not putting a new balance of money into the private sector, you're not getting that growth effect that you saw in the first 3 scenarios. So those are the highlights of that study. I would encourage you to, of course, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'd encourage you to read through it here or online. Ask me questions later on as you've had a chance to digest it. But again, the bottom line's, we're a low tax state. We're doing well on that front. We have some work to do because of what our neighbors are doing and our competitive states around the country. How you raise revenues does matter from an economic standpoint. And if at all possible, err on the side of putting money back into the private sector rather than spending it in the public sector.